On the night of September 11th, 2011, James Walker, a 20-year-old college sophomore, walked out of the campus library. It was just before midnight. Security cameras caught him leaving with a black jacket and a backpack. He was heading back to his dorm. That short walk should have taken 10 minutes. He never arrived. At 12:18 a.m., James's phone sent its final signal at the corner of Maple and 4th. After that, silence. His friends texted him, but the messages went unanswered. By morning, his roommate noticed the dorm room door left open. James was gone. No broken lock, no sign of struggle, no missing valuables. That afternoon, his parents reported him missing. Search teams moved through the campus and nearby streets. Within days, one strange clue surfaced. On September 15th, a pair of black gloves, believed to be James's, was found on a bench in a nearby park. Tests revealed no fingerprints. Security footage that could have helped was accidentally erased. A critical window of evidence had already closed. Investigators pressed forward with little to hold on to. Witnesses recalled seeing nothing unusual. No cars stopping, no strangers approaching. The last solid marker remained that phone signal at 12:18 a.m. From there, the trail ended. The lack of answers quickly fueled speculation. By October, attention shifted to people around him. A classmate, Derek Collins, had argued with James earlier that year. A delivery worker, Marcus Reed, was often near the dorm late at night. Both were questioned. Neither could be tied to the disappearance. Yet rumors spread faster than facts. The community began to treat them as guilty without proof. Their lives collapsed under the weight of suspicion. Years turned into silence. Then, a decade later, a new forensic lab reopened the evidence box. Advanced tools pulled fragments from erased video, rebuilt lost phone data, and retested fibers left behind. For the first time, a name surfaced that had never been part of the story. The real suspect lived only minutes away. This is the disappearance of James Walker. James Walker was born in 1991 in a small Vermont town. He was the only child in a working-class family. His father, Richard, worked as an electrician, often away on long projects. His mother, Linda, taught at a local elementary school. They were proud, steady people who lived by routine. James grew up in a home where nothing came easy, but everything was earned. His parents believed in discipline, education, and the value of keeping promises. By the fall of 2011, James was 20 years old and beginning his second year in college. He studied mechanical engineering at a university in the Northeast. It was not the biggest school in the country, but it was respected. Students came here to work, not to play. James fit right in. Professors knew him as dependable. He turned in assignments on time. He wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but he was steady. His grades placed him comfortably in the upper half of his class. Nobody thought he was in trouble. Nobody thought he was distracted. His daily life was structured. He lived in the dorms, shared space with another sophomore, and spent most evenings in the campus library. To help with tuition, he worked a part-time job shelving books at that same library. The staff described him as polite, quiet, and reliable. He was not the type to skip shifts or lose track of time. That steady rhythm made what happened later stand out even more. James had one hobby outside of school and work: photography. He liked walking the campus at night, camera in hand. capturing the way the lights fell across empty paths, or the way rain clung to glass windows. He joined the photography club in his first semester, and one of his pictures had even been used in a student magazine. He wasn't chasing fame or recognition. He just liked freezing a moment, studying how it looked when it could no longer move. Friends knew James as approachable. He wasn't the life of the party, but he was easy to get along with. He sat with different groups in the cafeteria, talked with classmates across majors, and showed up for study sessions. He didn't collect enemies. There were no grudges that anyone could recall, at least none that seemed serious. Still, two details later took on new weight. The first was a missed date. A week before his disappearance, James had arranged to meet a student for coffee. He never showed up. The meeting was never rescheduled, and the girl later told police she assumed he had simply forgotten. The second detail was an argument. Months earlier, in May 2011, James had clashed in class with another student, Derek Collins. They argued about a group project, raised voices in front of half the room. Most people forgot about it once the semester ended. But after James vanished, that single fight came back like a flashing signal. Romantic life did not complicate the picture. James had dated casually, but nothing lasted. There was no known girlfriend at the time of his disappearance. No jealous rivals. No breakups fresh enough to raise suspicion. Detectives would later remark how his personal life looked clean, free of the drama that often marks a young man's final days. That absence of chaos made the silence around his disappearance harder to explain. The fall semester had just started. Early September meant crowded lecture halls, football games on the weekends, and new faces flooding the dorms. The campus was buzzing, full of energy. James moved through it quietly, following his routine. His professors expected nothing unusual. His roommate said the same. The only thing that stood out was his habit of walking back from. On September 11th, 2011, James went through his day like any other. He worked his library shift, joined a study group, then headed back to the library one last time, late in the evening. Cameras confirmed his presence. Witnesses remembered him leaving around 11:50 p.m. He had his black jacket zipped up, backpack on, and nothing unusual in his manner. That was the last verified moment anyone saw him alive. By the morning of September 12th, his roommate noticed the dorm room door open, the bed untouched. No sign James had returned. That single detail rattled the campus. Within hours, calls spread from dorm to dorm. By afternoon, the missing person report was filed. For students who had just started the semester, it was a shock. No one expected danger here. This was supposed to be a safe environment, a place where the worst crime was a stolen laptop in the library. The local press covered the story immediately. A 20-year-old missing overnight, vanishing between the library and his dorm, was news that spread fast. Within a day, speculation was everywhere. Some said he might have run away. Others whispered about a hidden relationship. The most sober voices pointed to the fact that James had no reason to leave. He had class the next morning. His wallet and laptop were still in the room. He had left everything behind. Campus security worked with local police to set up search teams. They combed the immediate area, checked paths, and re-interviewed anyone who had seen him that night. But in those first hours, key steps were missed. Surveillance footage from nearby stores was not pulled right away. Witnesses were not tracked down quickly. The trail grew cold, before it had a chance to warm up. Students who wanted reassurance only found more questions. James's disappearance struck a nerve. He was ordinary in the best sense, hardworking, steady, and harmless. That made the mystery harder to accept. If someone like James could vanish walking home from the library, then nobody was untouchable. The community knew it. Parents of other students felt it. And the story grew beyond the campus, carried into local newspapers and evening news broadcasts. For investigators, the focus now turned to the final hours of September 11th. They had a narrow timeline, a silent phone signal, and a gap in surveillance coverage that left crucial minutes in the dark. What happened between the library doors and the corner of Maple and 4th would define the next decade of searching. At 11:50 p.m. on September 11, 2011, James Walker left the university library. The camera positioned above the main entrance caught him for a few seconds. He wore a black jacket, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The footage showed nothing unusual. He pushed through the glass doors, looked down at the pavement, and walked away. The library was closing for the night. Other students left in groups. James left alone. His dorm was only 10 minutes away. He should have been home by midnight. From that moment, the timeline is painfully short. Between the library steps and his dorm room, James disappeared. The phone he carried told the next part of the story. At 12:18 a.m. on September 12th, his device sent its last signal. The ping came from a tower near Maple and 4th Street, an intersection a few blocks from campus. Then the phone went dark. No more calls. No more GPS updates. Friends sent texts in the minutes that followed, but none went through. To investigators, that final ping was the last trace of James alive. Maple and 4th was a quiet corner. Streetlights covered part of the road, but stretches of sidewalk fell into shadow. No students reported seeing James there. No passing cars stopped. No one came forward saying they noticed anything. Days passed without progress. On September 15th, 4 days after he was last seen, a discovery jolted the search. A pair of black gloves, believed to belong to James, was found on a bench in a park near the edge of campus. It was a place students often walked through on their way to the dorms. The gloves were dry, left in plain view, as if they had been placed rather than dropped. Investigators sent them to the lab. The results came back inconclusive. No fingerprints, no blood, no DNA strong enough to identify. The gloves added more questions than answers. Beyond the gloves, nothing else surfaced. His wallet, laptop, and clothes were still in the dorm room. His bank cards were never used after September 11th. The account sat untouched. The absence of financial activity ruled out the possibility that James had run away. He hadn't taken money, and he hadn't prepared. Whatever happened that night was not planned by him. Attention shifted back to the one piece of digital evidence that mattered, the CCTV network. But by the time investigators moved to collect it, critical days had passed. A section of footage from a corner store near Maple and 4th had already been overwritten by the system. Other cameras that might have caught cars or pedestrians were set to erase automatically after 72 hours. By the time the police asked for it, it was gone. The only surviving video was the frame of James leaving the library at 11:50 p.m., and nothing more. This loss was catastrophic. Those missing clips might have shown whether James made it past the corner. They might have revealed a vehicle pulling over. They might have captured a stranger walking behind him. Instead, they were erased. A technical failure compounded by a slow response. For a family desperate for answers, it was devastating. For investigators, it left them almost blind. In those early days, police had little to hold. No signs of forced entry at the dorm. No indication James had planned to leave town. No trace of robbery. The timeline from the library exit. The conclusion at the end of September was grim. Police noted the evidence was too thin to reconstruct James's final walk. They couldn't say whether he had turned left or right at Maple and 4th. They couldn't say whether he had been approached or followed. They couldn't even prove he had made it to that intersection. The gloves added a clue, but no direction. Everything pointed to absence rather than presence. The family demanded answers. They wanted the search widened, more resources committed, more urgency. But officials pushed back. Without evidence of foul play, they treated James as a missing adult, not yet a crime victim. That distinction slowed everything. It meant fewer officers assigned, fewer warrants signed, and less priority in a department already stretched thin. The case was already faltering. The gold hours of investigation had slipped away. When police finally stood in front of the community to brief them, the words were clear but discouraging. "We do not have enough evidence to draw conclusions." It was an admission nobody wanted to hear. For the students who studied alongside James, it meant living with uncertainty. For his parents, it meant living with silence. For the two young men who would later fall under suspicion, it was the opening chapter of a nightmare. From the beginning, the investigation rested on fragile ground. Weak evidence, missed opportunities, and the disappearance of data that could never be recovered. It left a void where answers should have been. And that void became the breeding ground for rumors, speculation, and suspicion that would spread in the weeks ahead. The stage was set for mistakes. The family pressed harder for police to do more. Officers promised to expand their efforts. But instead of clarity, the next phase would reveal just how unprepared the investigation really was. Part 4 will uncover how those first missteps turned into lasting failures, how leads slipped through the cracks, and how the absence of evidence shaped the decade that followed. The first week after James Walker vanished was critical. Investigators knew it, his family knew it, and the students around him knew it. Yet what happened in those days would later be remembered not for decisive. Between September 12th and September 18th, 2011, the search for James never left the shadow of the campus. Officers walked the grounds, checked dorm basements, and drove slowly through nearby streets. But the search radius stayed narrow. It did not expand into the neighborhoods only blocks away. It did not reach the small park where his gloves would later be found. It did not extend to the bus station or the rail depot, both within walking distance. Volunteers joined in, but they were mostly students with no training. There were no professional search and rescue teams, no dogs, no helicopters. The scope was limited, and the clock was already against them. For James's parents, the lack of urgency was crushing. His father, Richard, recalled later, It felt like we were the only ones screaming. Everyone else was moving slow, as if time didn't matter. Time did matter. Every hour lost meant fewer chances to recover video, track movements, or spark memories in potential witnesses. Some of those witnesses did come forward in the first days. Residents near Maple and 4th told police they noticed activity close to midnight. One woman described seeing a figure on the sidewalk, maybe a student, and a car slowing down near the corner. Another neighbor remembered hearing a door slam, but when asked for details, he admitted, "I couldn't say if it was unusual or not." These early statements were written down quickly, without detail, and never followed up. None of the witnesses were asked to view photo arrays or repeat their accounts in depth. Their impressions faded as days turned into weeks. By the time detectives tried to circle back, the memories were gone. The strongest potential evidence lay in the city's cameras. The corner of Maple and 4th was surrounded by businesses. A gas station, a small grocery, and a 24-hour convenience store each had their own security systems. Yet when investigators finally requested the footage, it was too late. The grocery wiped its files every 72 hours. The convenience store saved its recordings for 1 week unless told otherwise. Both had already erased the data from the failures were not only technical. Coordination between campus security and local police broke down early. Campus officers, responsible for student safety, ran their own sweeps and interviews. Local detectives opened their own file. But the two sides did not share information effectively. Witness names sat in separate reports. Logs of student interviews were not transferred. Even the evidence from the gloves found in the park was delayed. Campus staff picked them up, logged them, and only later handed them to police. The chain of custody was already blurred. The Walker family pushed for more. Linda Walker, his mother, pleaded in interviews. Why aren't they searching the neighborhoods? Why aren't they knocking on every door? Our son didn't just vanish into air. But officers told the family resources were limited. They argued there was still no proof of foul play, only a missing adult who might have left voluntarily. That classification meant James's case did not receive the top priority reserved for clear abductions or violent crimes. Inside the department, the phrase, "no evidence of a crime," appeared again and again in the paperwork. To James's parents, those words were unbearable. To them, the absence of evidence was not proof of safety. It was proof that evidence had not been properly gathered. By late September, frustration spread beyond the family. The campus community began to question the investigation openly. Student groups held forums demanding more transparency. Posters went up not only asking for James's return but criticizing the response. The student newspaper published an editorial. "Have the authorities already given up?" The editorial accused investigators of letting opportunities slip, warning that every delay made the case colder. Local media soon joined in. The town's daily paper ran a headline, "Where is James Walker, and why are police moving so slowly?" The piece highlighted the gaps: footage erased, witnesses ignored, searches too small. Parents of other students began to call the university, asking what was being done to protect their own children. The tension between the family and the police grew sharper. At a community meeting, Richard Walker spoke directly to the officers leading the case. His words were blunt. "You're telling us you don't see a The result was a vacuum. In the absence of facts, rumors filled the space. Students whispered about classmates James had argued with. Online forums speculated about strangers seen near the dorms. Some claimed James had secret troubles. Others suggested a local with a criminal past. The university tried to calm the speculation, but it spread faster than facts could catch up. That was the lasting consequence of the early investigation. When the official narrative failed to provide answers, the unofficial ones took over. And in that swirl of suspicion, two names would soon surface. One was a classmate, Derek Collins, remembered for a loud argument with James months earlier. The other was Marcus Reed, a delivery worker with a minor record who happened to pass near the dorms at night. Neither had evidence against them, but in the eyes of many, they became suspects long before the word innocent was ever considered. The foundation had been laid. A weak investigation, missed chances, and lost trust turned a straightforward disappearance into a stage for rumor and accusation. James's family was left without clarity. Derek and Marcus were about to be pulled into a storm they could not escape. The early investigation should have closed doors and narrowed the field. Instead, it left holes large enough for the entire community to fall through. The mistakes of September 2011 created scars that would last 10 years. Part 5 will trace how those rumors solidified, how Derek and Marcus became the faces of suspicion, and how lives already fragile were broken by whispers treated as facts. October 2011. A full month had passed since James Walker disappeared. Leads had dried up. The gloves found on the park bench revealed nothing. The phone signal stopped cold at Maple and 4th. No vehicle, no body, no trace. The investigation was stuck. Families pressed for answers. Students demanded safety. Local reporters asked why police still had no suspect. Under growing pressure, detectives turned their attention not to new evidence, but to people who already carried shadow. Derek was a junior in computer science, a classmate of James. He was sharp, ambitious, and outspoken. Back in May, 4 months before the disappearance, he and James had clashed during a group project. The argument happened in front of half the lecture hall. Voices rose, words cut. Derek walked out red-faced while James stayed seated. By fall, the incident was history. For James, it was just another college dispute. For Derek, it was forgotten in the rush of classes and coding assignments. But when police went looking for someone with a possible motive, that argument resurfaced. Whispers began in the dorms. Students repeated the story like it had happened yesterday. "Didn't Derek blow up at James?" one student recalled. Another added, "I always thought he took it too personally." When detectives came knocking, Derek admitted the clash but insisted it meant nothing. "It was just schoolwork. I didn't hate him," he told investigators. Still, the fact that he had lost his temper in public made him look unstable to some. Reporters seized on the narrative. A local paper ran a headline, "Classroom Clash Raises Questions." Suddenly, Derek wasn't just another student. He was the classmate with a grudge. Marcus was different. He wasn't a student. He was a 24-year-old delivery worker who passed through campus most nights. He dropped off supplies at the convenience store on Main, and sometimes cut through the streets near the dorms. Marcus had a record. Nothing violent, a shoplifting charge as a teenager, a DUI in his early 20s. But in the eyes of the public, a record meant danger. When police canvassed the area, a neighbor recalled seeing a man hanging around near Maple and 4th. The description was vague, but it roughly matched Marcus. That was enough to draw attention. Detectives brought him in for questioning. He explained he was working his route that night. He didn't know James. He didn't stop at Maple and 4th. But the shadow of his past crimes followed him. Soon a different set of headlines appeared. Delivery man with criminal record seen near campus. Reporters painted Marcus as the mysterious outsider. By late October, two competing stories gripped the community. On one side, Derek, the classmate with a public feud. On the other, Marcus, the outsider with a record. Television segments repeated their names. Radio shows asked listeners to call in with theories. Social media exploded. Students shared Derek's photo from the yearbook with captions like, "Watch this guy." Others dug into Marcus's old arrest records and posted them online. Neither man had been charged. Both denied involvement. But in the court of public opinion, innocence no longer mattered. One former roommate of Derek's recalled, people stopped sitting with him in class. They acted like being near him was dangerous. A neighbor of Marcus said, customers stopped answering the door when he delivered. Parents pulled their kids inside when he walked past. The media had done what evidence could not. It turned two men into prime suspects. Police questioned Derek multiple times between October and November. They asked him about his whereabouts, his relationship with James, his emotions during the fight. Each time he gave the same answers. He was in his dorm the night James vanished. He hadn't spoken to James in weeks. He had no reason to hurt him. Marcus faced the same cycle. Detectives pressed him on his delivery routes, checked his timesheets, and scrutinized his car. Nothing tied him to James, but suspicion lingered. Behind closed doors, officers admitted the evidence was thin. But in front of cameras, they didn't rule out either man. The lack of denial kept the narrative alive. By winter 2011, Derek and Marcus lived under constant suspicion. Derek's classmates stopped inviting him to study groups. He walked across campus alone, whispers following him. His grades slipped. He withdrew from extracurriculars. Some professors quietly questioned if he should remain enrolled. Marcus lost customers. His employer received calls demanding he be fired. Within months, he was let go, forced to pick up odd jobs just to stay afloat. Neighbors crossed the street when they saw him. Stranger. By November, detectives still had no solid proof. The gloves carried no prints. The phone data was inconclusive. CCTV footage was gone. But the damage to Derek and Marcus was already done. They had become symbols, not suspects. Symbols of failure, of fear, of suspicion turned into fact. Their names circulated in every conversation about the case. For many, James's disappearance wasn't about evidence anymore. It was about these two men who must have known something. The truth, however, was that both had nothing to do with James's fate. The real culprit remained hidden, unnoticed, while Derek and Marcus carried the burden of guilt. Looking back, October and November of 2011 were not just months of lost opportunities in the investigation. They were the months when innocent lives were shattered by rumor. A professor later admitted, "We failed Derek. We didn't give him the presumption of innocence. We treated him as guilty because it was easier." A family friend of Marcus said, "He was punished not for what he did, but for what people wanted to believe." The emotional climax of this chapter is not the discovery of a clue, but the destruction of 2 lives. Derek and Marcus were never arrested, never convicted. But the community had already issued a sentence. This was only the beginning. In the years that followed, Derek would leave campus under pressure. Marcus would lose his livelihood. Both would carry the label of suspect long after the case went cold. Part 6 will uncover what happened next, how the rumors followed them into every corner of their lives, how families broke under the weight of accusation, and how 2 men who had nothing to do with James Walker's disappearance became prisoners of suspicion for nearly a decade. By early 2012, only months after James Walker disappeared, the investigation was already stalled. No new evidence had surfaced, no confirmed leads. Yet in the vacuum left by silence, suspicion had grown louder than facts. 2 names, Derek Collins and Marcus Reed, were repeated in classrooms, in coffee shops, and on local news tickers. And even though no charges had ever been filed, both young men began to live as if they had already been convicted. Derek Collins was only 21 years old in 2011. A third-year computer science student, his future looked secure. His grades were solid, his parents were proud, and he had every expectation of entering the tech field after graduation. But after October 2011, his name was no longer tied to coursework or projects. It was tied to James Walker's disappearance. The reason was simple but devastating. Months earlier, in May 2011, Derek and James had clashed during a group project. It was a sharp argument in front of other students. Tempers flared, words were exchanged, and the moment stuck in people's memories. Once James went missing, that isolated argument became a story of motive. Everyone remembered that fight, one classmate later recalled. It suddenly looked like Derek had a reason. By January 2012, Derek could no longer function on campus. Friends distanced themselves. He was removed from a study group where he had been a core member. Professors quietly avoided pairing him with others. His scholarship was suspended. The stress on his family grew. His parents spent thousands hiring lawyers to defend his name, though no charges were filed. The damage was not only financial. Derek began missing classes. His grades slipped. He avoided dining halls and libraries because he felt eyes on him everywhere he went. The whispers, the looks, the subtle distance from people who once worked alongside him. It became unbearable. In the spring of 2012, Derek officially withdrew, telling administrators he needed time away. But the truth was clear. Suspicion had forced him out. One professor, Marcus Reed's story unfolded differently, but ended just as painfully. At 24, Marcus wasn't a student. He worked nights, delivering for a convenience store near campus. He had a minor record, small thefts as a teenager, a DUI years earlier. Nothing violent, nothing connected to James. But when rumors spread that someone had seen him near Maple and 4th, the night James's phone went dark, Marcus became an easy target. The local press painted the picture quickly. A man with a troubled past, roaming late at night near the place where a student vanished. It was enough to brand him as dangerous. Customers who recognized him from newspaper headlines stopped answering the door when he came by. Within weeks, his employer let him go, citing pressure and safety concerns. Unemployed, Marcus tried to find other work, but every interview ended the same way. Someone would mention the case, someone would remember the articles. Doors kept closing. Worse, the community itself turned hostile. Neighbors who once nodded to him on the street stopped speaking. Some began crossing the road to avoid him. Anonymous letters appeared in his mailbox, one of them bluntly stating, "We know what you did." He later told a friend, "It feels like I was sentenced without ever stepping into a courtroom." By mid-2012, Marcus was working only occasional labor jobs. His family's finances collapsed under unpaid bills. Creditors called daily. The Reed family's reputation, already fragile, was crushed. His younger sister dropped out of school after being taunted by classmates. "Your brother's a murderer." For Marcus, survival itself became an exhausting cycle. And unlike Derek, who had some family wealth to fall back on, Marcus had no safety net. The suspicion consumed not only his opportunities, but also his family's dignity. The university community, meanwhile, carried on. Administrators scheduled public forums to address safety concerns. Students gathered to discuss James's disappearance, demanding accountability and better campus security. James's name was spoken often, but Derek's and Marcus's names lingered in the background, always attached to suspicion, rarely to sympathy. At these forums, Derek sat quietly in the back once, but left early after hearing his own name whispered. Marcus never attended. Neither felt safe enough to confront the rumors head-on, and almost no one defended them. To speak up for Derek or Marcus was to risk association with them. For most students, silence was safer. As a result, the rumors hardened into perceived truth. Within a year, both men had become the two likely suspects in everyday conversation, even without evidence. This stigma lasted long after media coverage waned. Even as the investigation went cold, the labels did not fade. Derek and Marcus were not only fighting for their innocence, but against a collective memory that treated suspicion as fact. Between 2012 and 2015, the case of James Walker remained unsolved. Leads dried up. Police offered no new statements. And yet Derek and Marcus continued living under the shadow of guilt. Derek attempted to return to school in 2014, but his application for reinstatement was quietly stalled. Administrators cited ongoing concerns, though no charges had ever been brought against him. He took part-time jobs in IT support, but interviews always circled back to the case. Employers hesitated, even without proof. Marcus fared worse. By 2015, he was deep in debt. He bounced between temporary construction work and seasonal labor. Employers who Googled his name found news clips branding him linked to missing student. Even without convictions, the digital trail destroyed every chance he had at recovery. In those years, both men lived under an invisible sentence. Derek lost faith in education as a pathway to redemption. Marcus lost faith in society altogether. Neither could see an end to the stigma. The press had largely... By the late 2010s, the James Walker case was considered a cold file. Students had graduated, professors had retired, and the story had faded from headlines. But for Derek and Marcus, the consequences never faded. Their reputations, careers, and futures had been permanently scarred. And then, almost a decade later, something shifted. In 2021, a new data forensics lab opened its doors. Advances in digital reconstruction and environmental DNA gave investigators tools they hadn't possessed in 2011. James's family, still desperate for answers, urged police to resubmit old evidence. For the first time in 10 years, there was hope that facts, not rumors, could finally determine what had happened. It was this moment that began to unravel the decade-long injustice. The years of suspicion that destroyed Derek and Marcus's lives would soon collide with the discovery that changed everything. Part 7 reveals how that breakthrough unfolded and how science succeeded where human judgment had failed. Before this story can move forward, I want to hear from you. Do you think Derek and Marcus ever had a chance to rebuild their lives, or were they marked forever by suspicion? Leave your thoughts below, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter. Because in Part 7, everything changes. A single breakthrough in forensic technology, 10 years later, finally cracks open the truth. By 2021, the case of James Walker had been silent for nearly a decade. The file sat in storage, a symbol of failure. Investigators had no clear suspect, no physical evidence strong enough to hold in court, and no leads worth pursuing. Derek Collins and Marcus Reed were still remembered as the two men who probably did it, even though no charges had ever been filed. The families lived with that cloud every day. That year, a new forensic data laboratory opened its doors in the state. It was built around one mission: to apply modern technology to cold cases. They specialized in environmental DNA testing, advanced imaging algorithms, and cellular signal reconstruction. The facility promised something older detectives had dreamed of. That single fact changed the story. For 10 years, the community had pointed fingers at Derek and Marcus. Now, science erased those accusations. For the first time, there was scientific proof that they had been falsely tied to the disappearance. The lab then turned to the video evidence. A box of old discs stored by the campus security office was brought in. Most of it had been written off years earlier, too blurry, too damaged, overwritten by system errors. But in June 2021, engineers ran the recordings through a new AI-based image restoration system. Frame by frame, the algorithm sharpened shapes that the human eye could never detect. One particular sequence stood out. It was the corner of Maple and 4th, the last place James's phone had pinged at 12:18 a.m. In the old file, all you could see was static. In the restored version, a vehicle appeared. The shape was boxy, the color dark green or blue, the lights dim. For the first time, investigators had visual confirmation that a car was present at the exact moment James vanished. The analysis didn't stop there. The software identified reflective surfaces and partial plate fragments. It wasn't a full license plate, but it was enough to narrow down vehicle types registered in the county. Investigators now had something they had never possessed: a potential car to connect to the crime. Meanwhile, another team worked on cellular data. The technology available in 2011 had logged James's last call, his last text, and the final tower hit. But the raw data, kept in the carrier's archives, still existed. With modern reconstruction tools, experts were able to map the trajectory of his phone's signal in the minutes before it went dead. In August 2021, the analysis revealed that the phone had not simply powered off in James's pocket. The signal drift showed movement consistent with being inside a vehicle, leaving the area at a steady pace. The trail ended not near campus, but in the outskirts, about a 12-minute drive away. The exact neighborhood could now be identified for the first time. This was the breakthrough detectives had been waiting for. 10 years of dead ends and the reopening of the investigation sparked cautious hope. Media outlets reported on the technological revival of cold cases, naming James Walker's file as the first major test. Commentators noted how advances in forensic science had caught up with the mistakes of the past. And within weeks, the new evidence began to converge on one man. But before that name surfaced, the case had to go through a quiet but critical phase. The gloves were run through multiple labs to confirm the DNA findings. The video footage was reviewed by independent experts to ensure it hadn't been misinterpreted. The cellular analysis was double-checked against archived weather and tower load records. Each step held, and each step reinforced the conclusion. James's disappearance was not linked to Derek Collins or Marcus Reed. The crime belonged to someone else entirely. For Derek, who had lived with whispered accusations for years, this was a turning point. When he heard the news, he said, "It's what I always knew, but now I can finally prove it." Marcus, quieter, simply told a reporter, "I hope people remember this when they look at me." Both men still carried the scars of suspicion, but science had begun to restore their names. As investigators pieced the story together, the focus narrowed to the unknown driver of the dark vehicle. Registration databases showed fewer than 24 possible matches. Among them was a man who lived in the very neighborhood where James's phone had last signaled. A man whose name had never appeared in the original investigation. That man was Colin Hayes. The revelation was about to turn the entire case upside down. September 2021. For 10 long years, the case had gone nowhere. Derek Collins and Marcus Reed still carried the weight of suspicion. Families had been torn apart. A community had grown cynical. And James Walker's parents had no answers. But that fall, the investigation took a dramatic turn. When forensic analysts restored the blurred footage from Maple and Fourth, a shape finally emerged. A vehicle, dark green, paused at the intersection minutes after James's phone pinged there for the last time. Investigators traced registration records, narrowing the... In October 2021, police secured a search warrant. The team entered Hayes' home, unsure of what they would find. Within hours, the search changed the entire case. On a desk drawer, investigators discovered a USB drive. At first glance, it seemed ordinary, but when digital analysts opened it, the contents were unmistakable. Files belonging to James Walker appeared on screen. Class notes, photos from his camera, even half-written emails. It was an item James had used daily in 2011, and one his family confirmed had never been recovered. The evidence didn't stop there. Forensic specialists examined Hayes' green sedan. On the passenger seat, beneath the fabric, they lifted microscopic fibers. Laboratory comparison confirmed the match. The fibers were consistent with the gloves found near campus in 2011. James's gloves. This was no coincidence, no fabrication. For the first time, tangible evidence tied a living suspect directly to James Walker. Hayes was brought in for questioning. At first, he played it cool. He claimed he had found the USB near the library years earlier, picked it up, and kept it. He insisted he had never met James, never seen him that night. But investigators now had more than circumstantial suspicion. They had physical proof. DNA trace evidence collected from the gloves excluded Derek and Marcus. Instead, environmental DNA lifted from the car interior pointed squarely at Hayes. As detectives presented each piece, the USB, the fiber analysis, the restored video of his car, Hayes's confidence cracked. Hours passed. His story shifted. He admitted being near Maple and 4th that night but denied involvement in anything violent. Under mounting pressure, he finally conceded. He was present when James disappeared. The admission was partial, evasive, but enough. After 10 years of silence, the man who had never been on the radar was suddenly at the center of the case. The news broke in November 2021. Police held a press conference announcing the arrest of Colin Hayes. For Derek Collins and Marcus Reed, it was both a relief. The reopening of the investigation sparked cautious hope. Media outlets reported on the technological revival of cold cases, naming James Walker's file as the first major test. Commentators noted how advances in forensic science had caught up with the mistakes of the past. And within weeks, the new evidence began to converge on one man. But before that name surfaced, the case had to go through a quiet but critical phase. The gloves were run through multiple labs to confirm the DNA findings. The video footage was reviewed by independent experts to ensure it hadn't been misinterpreted. The cellular analysis was double-checked against archived weather and tower load records. Each step held, and each step reinforced the conclusion. James's disappearance was not linked to Derek Collins or Marcus Reed. The crime belonged to someone else entirely. For Derek, who had lived with whispered accusations for years, this was a turning point. When he heard the news, he said, "It's what I always knew, but now I can finally prove it." Marcus, quieter, simply told a reporter, "I hope people remember this when they look at me." Both men still carried the scars of suspicion, but science had begun to restore their names. As investigators pieced the story together, the focus narrowed to the unknown driver of the dark vehicle. Registration databases showed fewer than 24 possible matches. Among them was a man who lived in the very neighborhood where James's phone had last signaled. A man whose name had never appeared in the original investigation. That man was Colin Hayes. The revelation was about to turn the entire case upside down. September 2021. For 10 long years, the case had gone nowhere. Derek Collins and Marcus Reed still carried the weight of suspicion. Families had been torn apart. A community had grown cynical. And James Walker's parents had no answers. But that fall, the investigation took a dramatic turn. When forensic analysts restored the blurred footage from Maple and 4th, a shape finally emerged. A vehicle, dark green, paused at the intersection minutes after James's phone pinged there for the last time. Investigators traced registration records, narrowing the... In May 2022, more than 10 years after James Walker vanished, the case finally reached the courtroom. The man at the center was Colin Hayes, 37 years old, a quiet mechanic who had lived only a few miles from the university campus. For a decade, his name had never surfaced. Now the state of Vermont was ready to prove that he was the one responsible for James's disappearance. The evidence was not a single smoking gun. It was a chain, built piece by piece, each link strong enough to stand on its own but devastating when combined. Fibers from James's gloves matched fibers recovered from Colin's car seat. Environmental DNA confirmed traces that could only have come from James's belongings. Reconstructed mobile tower data placed Colin's car at Maple and 4th exactly where James's phone had gone silent at 12:18 a.m. The USB drive found in Colin's home contained James's personal files, photos, unfinished assignments, email drafts, that no one else could have planted without direct contact. Colin's defense attorney tried to push back. He claimed the evidence was circumstantial, that fibers could have transferred in other ways, that a USB could have been found and kept without malicious intent. But the prosecution built a relentless timeline. They showed how the gaps in 2011, once dismissed as empty, were now filled by technology. They emphasized how Derek Collins and Marcus Reed had lived under a false shadow for 10 years, while the real suspect lived undisturbed only minutes from the scene. One line from the prosecution's closing stayed with everyone in the courtroom. This case is not just about a man who disappeared. It is about what happens when truth is delayed, when suspicion replaces evidence, and when technology finally gives voice to a victim who was silent for a decade. The jury deliberated less than 2 days. Colin Hayes was found guilty of charges directly connected to the disappearance of James Walker. He received a long prison sentence, ensuring he would spend decades behind bars. For the Walker family, it was the first real closure after years of uncertainty. For Derek and Marcus, it was proof they had carried a burden that never should have been theirs. The day Colin Hayes was convicted, within weeks of the trial, Derek's lawyer filed civil suits against newspapers that had printed his photo in 2011, with headlines suggesting he was the feuding classmate. The case was not about money, Derek explained. It was about forcing those institutions to admit they had been wrong. Some outlets issued public apologies. Others resisted. The process itself was long and exhausting, but Derek finally felt he was taking control of the story that had nearly ruined his life. Marcus Reed's path was different, but equally painful. In 2011, he was just a delivery worker with a minor record, trying to hold a job and support his family. Once suspicion fell on him, his world collapsed. Customers stopped opening their doors when they saw him. His employer fired him. For years he drifted between temporary jobs, struggling with debt and depression. After Colin's arrest, Marcus sued his former employer and several media outlets that had painted him as the dangerous stranger. His case highlighted how bias and prejudice amplified suspicion, turning a man's mistakes as a teenager into a life sentence of distrust. When Marcus spoke publicly after the trial, he said, "I was never on trial in court, but I was on trial in my own town for 10 years. Neither Derek nor Marcus could get those years back, but both gained recognition. Their names were cleared, their innocence officially acknowledged. For the first time in a decade, people shook their hands instead of avoiding them." The verdict against Colin Hayes forced more than just apologies. It sparked reform. In 2023, the local police department released new guidelines on handling missing person cases. Every officer underwent mandatory training about the golden hours of investigation, how every lost CCTV file, every uncollected witness statement could cripple a case for years. The department also established a permanent digital archive system to prevent surveillance footage from being overwritten. New partnerships with forensic labs ensured that even minor evidence would be preserved for potential future reanalysis. The university took its own steps. Administrators acknowledged for Richard and Linda Walker, James's parents, the trial was both an end and a beginning. Richard, once silent and withdrawn, began speaking publicly about the need for better handling of missing person cases. Linda joined advocacy groups supporting families waiting for answers in cold cases. In one interview, she said, "We lived a nightmare. But if telling our story prevents even one family from going through the same, then at least something good comes from James's loss. As for Colin Hayes, his conviction revealed little about his motives. He never gave a full explanation, only fragments of confession under pressure. Some speculated he targeted James at random, others that there was an unspoken interaction that night. But for the court and for the family, motive mattered less than accountability. Colin Hayes was no longer a ghost in the background. He was a convicted man behind bars. The story of James Walker became a case study in both failure and redemption. Failure because the first investigation had been careless, allowing critical evidence to vanish and leaving two innocent men to suffer. Redemption because technology finally restored the pieces and gave clarity after years of doubt. The lesson echoed far beyond Vermont. Justice demands patience. Rumors cannot replace evidence. And when society moves too fast to blame, the damage may be permanent. Derek and Marcus, though scarred, became advocates in their own right. Derek spoke at universities about misinformation and the dangers of public judgment. Marcus joined local community centers, helping young people with troubled pasts avoid being defined forever by mistakes. Even the police admitted the case reshaped their culture. An officer involved in the 2011 investigation said in 2023, "We learned the hard way that treating a disappearance as low priority costs lives, reputations, and trust. We will not make that mistake again." In the end, the Walker family had answers. Derek and Marcus had their names restored, and a community had hard lessons carved into memory. But one question remains for us today. After 10 years of false suspicion, can two men ever truly